Is the famous author here?
I'm Francisco, the director here at the Society. Thank you everyone for coming. Our guest speaker for the evening is Dietrich, who retired as professor of music and professor of performing arts at Ripon College in 2019, where he taught since 1980. He graduated from Lawrence University, where he studied with Marge Irvin, Derald, DeYoung, and John Harmon, and played in the band of the legendary Frank Schroeder. He received his master's degree from Northwestern University, where he studied trombone with another legend, Chicago Symphony trombonist Frank Crisafulli. He earned his doctorate from University of Wisconsin-Madison. His first book, Duke's Bones, Ellington's Great Trombonists, was published in 1995. His subsequent books were Jazz Bones, The World of Jazz Trombone, Wisconsin Riffs, Jazz Profiles from the Heartland, and his latest book, Never Givin Up, The Life and Music of Jarreau, published in 2023. Tonight, Kurt will speak about jazz in Ripon and East Central Wisconsin. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for being here. And if you read the local paper 2 weeks ago, you came here thinking that this talk is about my Jarreau book. And then if you read subsequent announcements, you think it's about jazz in East Central Wisconsin and whatever. So I'm actually going to do a little bit of each. There's no use getting into too much depth, is there? You know, I'll just kind of whip through them, and I'm going to just grab a few little kind of profile things and talk about them. Feel free to ask questions anytime until you get obnoxious, and then I'll ignore you. I do want to thank Karen and anybody else here who was responsible for bringing me here. And a little bit of advertising. So this is the Wisconsin Riffs book, and I actually talked here about this book 4 or 5 years ago sometime. I think it was before COVID, but it came out in 2019. So, you know, anyway, so I did that. And this is on a timer. I don't want that. So we'll just hang on. I may be going back and forth because I don't know where the timer is. But this is the latest book, and this is Jarreau. In case any of you came here just thinking, I can't come to a presentation like this without going home with a book, I can help you out with that. So end of advertisement. So Wisconsin Riffs, which I wrote over quite a long time because I was working for a living back then. And I interviewed over 100 people for that book, is a whole bunch of profiles, as the title suggests, of jazz people. And I started out, I was going to write a history of jazz in Wisconsin. I better not get into too much background or we'll be here all night. But anyway, at a certain point, I decided, no, I can't do that. But I'll talk about people who did jazz in Wisconsin and are still doing jazz. And so there were all these people I talked to. But I started out that book, which is big and fat and heavy. It'll cost you dearly if you want one of these. The first 3 chapters are about individual players who were the first 3, they were all big stars of jazz at a certain point. And the first one of those was not exactly from East Central Wisconsin, but there he is. Yeah, right? He's the one in the middle. Does that tell you anything? No, it tells you nothing, except he's there with his brother and his cousin. The guy in the middle grew up to be, stop, I don't want you going on, Bunny Berrigan. And he was one of the great trumpet players of the swing era. And Bunny Berrigan, he was born in Hilbert. Some of you know where Hilbert is. You know where Hilbert is. And in 1908, but when he was just a few years old, his family moved to Fox Lake. Now, all the time I've lived in Ripon, I've never thought of, oh yeah, I live near Fox Lake, but it's only 21 miles from here. And Fox Lake used to be kind of a big deal. It was a resort town, and lots of Chicago people came up there for the summers and when the weather was good and all that kind of thing. So Bunny Berrigan, his real name was Roland Bernard Berrigan, but he was known as Bunny from a really young age. He grew up there, and I went back and looked at a couple things. Yeah, he played in the Fox Lake Juvenile Band. He played in area bands like Merrill Owen and his Pennsylvanians, which was a Wisconsin band, and a band from Fond du Lac led by Cy Malberg. And he did all this while he was a young person, like in his early teens, because he could already play by then. He was starting to get a little out of hand, and his parents thought, well, let's send him down to live with his brother in Madison. That'll be a good thing for him. It was a terrible thing for him. He didn't, because he wasn't doing well in school. Well, once he got to Madison, it was like, school, what's that? But he did a lot of playing, and his uncle was a player also. But again, to make a long story quite short, eventually he got with an area band, which is to say one of the Midwestern bands, and was touring. Guys in touring bands from New York heard him and said, what are you doing out here? Go to New York. So he went to New York, and he was such a fabulous player that soon he was getting great work in New York, including with this band. I don't suppose there are any people who know bands from the 30s well enough to know who this is. Gary, look to the far right. It's Tommy Dorsey. And Tommy Dorsey, the guy standing playing trombone, is Tommy Dorsey. And he was one of the really popular band leaders of the 1930s. And Bunny, by then, was this big, strapping, good-looking guy on the left side of the trumpet section at the top. And he was tall and strong and good-looking and had an amazing talent. In fact, Louis Armstrong, the most respected trumpet player probably in the history of jazz, he said very publicly a couple of times, Bunny's my favorite trumpet player. Now, maybe he was just talking, but he liked him a lot. So Bunny played with the Dorsey band and recorded a couple of really famous solos, because that was the pop music of the time. And if you knew these records, you knew what Bunny Berrigan sounded like. And then he had another, oops, I forgot, I didn't put him in, but he also had a stint where he played briefly with Benny Goodman, but he happened to be there at the right time and played two really famous recorded solos with Benny Goodman also. And then what happened during those days was that people, if you were a star player, they'd say, you should have your own band, and I'm the perfect guy to be your manager or whatever, your publicist. So they talked Bunny into leading his own band, and he looked great and he sounded great, but he was a terrible band leader. He had no business sense. Unfortunately, he drank too much. He still played great all the time, but he was just one of the guys. And actually, if you're a leader, you can't be just one of the guys. And but he had one big hit with his band. And when I was first in Wisconsin, I came to Wisconsin at the tender age of 18 in 1969. And you could still find on jukeboxes in Wisconsin Bunny Berrigan's hit from 1939, I think it was, 37. Anyway, I Can't Get Started. And years later, I still used to go to this supper club out west of Appleton, and I Can't Get Started was still on the jukebox then. And this was, 30 years after that tune had been a hit, but it was still a hit. And talking about music isn't nearly as good as listening to music. So I've got just the tail end of I Can't Get Started that I'm pretty sure is going to play now. We'll see. High F, Ruth. That was pretty high back in those days. It's still pretty high, isn't it? Yeah. And he also sang on this record, which is part of the reason it sold so well, even though he wasn't a very good singer. People just loved the record and they loved the song. Okay, if you can't take the pain, don't listen. But Bunny Berrigan died in 1942. He was 33 years old. And you know why he died. And somebody gave me a hard time for describing it this way the last time I talked, but he had what I sometimes refer to as Wisconsin disease. He was an alcoholic, and eventually it killed him. So that was Bunny Berrigan, but his star was very bright for a number of years. So are you ready for a huge time and style shift? You better be, because that's what's happening next. Okay, we're going up 40 some years, 45 years. It was the 70s. Okay, now I'm using this picture for two different reasons. One is, okay, so I was in this band. I'm the one on the right. I was going to say the shady looking one, but a bunch of us looked shady back then. This was a promo shot that was taken at a jazz club in Houston, Texas, and it was a band called Matrix. And we toured for 5.5 years, made records, had a wonderful young person's life during that time, but it wasn't wonderful all the time. But just again, so I came to Wisconsin in 1969. I went to Lawrence. I know I shouldn't say that in this town, but I lived with it for 40 years at Ripon College. Anyway, and then I went to graduate school and got a master's degree for a year, and then this band started. And so it was really, I was like 23, and it was like running away with the circus. And we started out as a bar band in Wisconsin, but eventually we toured the whole United States, played the big festivals, and like I said, we made records. But I'm also using this to introduce a person I want to talk about at much more length, which is the person right in the middle standing, who is John Harmon, who some of you know, and you recognize him, right, even from this picture, who had been our teacher at Lawrence and was about 16, 15, 18 years older than the rest of us, and was the mastermind behind this group. Here's a picture of us. We look a little bit better a couple years later. This PR shot was taken on the roof of the Warner Brothers building in New York City, or not the roof, but that level just before you get to the roof. Anyway, and we were doing pretty well by then. And I'm not going to play it too much, but this will be a little bit of a culture switch shock also. But I'm going to play just a little bit of music here. John Harmon, who is now this one in that picture, he wrote the majority of our music. Other guys wrote quite a bit, but he wrote most of it. And he was supposed to be the adult in the room, and he wasn't so good at that. but he was a great musician, and he is still playing. You can hear him any Friday night at Manila, the restaurant in Oshkosh, and he's 89 years old and he's still playing like crazy. He's a wonderful player still. But this is sort of what we were doing in the 70s. I chose this tune. It was the first tune on our second album, and he wrote it, but it was named for him too. He was known to us as Weasel, and this is the King Weasel Stomp. I think it'll work. Just going to let it play for a little while here. Okay. I could play fast back then. And that was sort of representative of our music. We did a lot of different styles, but it was in that ballpark. Now, this is a picture much later. I can't remember. I should have looked up the date of this. And all these pictures are in this book. I think all the ones I've shown so far. And here is John. I don't know. This was in the 90s, 2000s, I think, with a great singer from this part of the world also. I don't know if you call it East Central Wisconsin, but it's going to have to do. And that is Janet Planet. And Janet is a great singer, and she and John have done a bunch of projects together, a whole bunch of projects. And this picture is actually from a performance that they did in Russia. There was an exchange kind of thing that goes on, and artists were going there at that time. I don't think artists from US would go there right now, but it was during one of those times when it was okay to go to Russia. And so there they are. And I probably should have, instead of playing the Matrix thing, played something. Janet and John have made 2 records together where it's just the 2 of them, her singing and him playing. And they are just lovely things. And she has sung in various different kinds of arenas. Also, Janet grew up in Appleton. Believe it or not, her last name was not Planet. It was Heimerman. So, that didn't play too well where she was first doing her things. And she grew up, she was kind of on the wrong side of the tracks, and her dad was in and out of her life, but mostly out. And so her mom was raising her and her 5 brothers and sisters, and it was kind of a hard scrabble life. In high school, she could sing better than anybody, but the cool girls didn't like her. There was that whole thing going on. And when she finished high school, she went to the tech school, and I believe that she got an associate's degree in, I should read my own books, but in like early childhood education. But in the meantime, she was just trying to make ends meet. And so she was bartending during a good bit of that time at I'll just blurt it out, at a strip joint, but she was bartending there to make money. And then she started singing, and she started out as a rock and roll singer. And then she discovered the blues and was singing a lot of blues. And eventually she discovered jazz. And she is really just a great jazz singer. And she has toured lots of places. She's, as you know, been to Russia. She's been other places in Europe. She's been to Japan. She goes to New York about once a year and does some work out there. But she has chosen just to stay in sort of east central Wisconsin. Does Oshkosh count? It's going to have to. Okay. So that's where Janet still lives. And she's now married to Tom Washatka, who is a great saxophonist around the area. And they have a record label that puts out her records, but records by a lot of other area artists also. And I could tell you lots more about both of these people, but if I do, we'll never get through the night. But check them out and look up Janet Planet. I think there's some other Janet Planet on the planet here, but look up the one, Janet Planet jazz singer, and you'll eventually get to her website and all that. And if you get a chance to hear her sing, and she sings around here quite a bit, go check her out in person. Okay. Now, here's something that I had sort of forgotten about, but I thought, well, if I'm going to talk about jazz in east central Wisconsin, I should talk about this event, which was recurring for 11 years. And that was the Ripon Jazz Festival. It went from 1993 to 2003. And I went back today and looked at my date books. I have date books for most of my life. And I thought I'd played at the Ripon Jazz Fest 2-3 times maybe. Well, I found 7. And I'm missing 2 books from that era, or 3 books. So I guess I played quite a bit. But I was always just a sideman. Somebody else would say, hey, do you want to play? I'll say, sure. You're going to pay me, right? And he'd say, yeah. And I was a little, we're all friends here, right? So I was a little surprised that Craig T-Bon, who many of you know, the downtown guy, he never asked me to have a band for Ripon Jazz Fest, which I thought was a little odd, but I just said fine. So my good friend Steve Yeomans, who is a chiropractor but loves to play jazz, and he'll go after a gig anytime he can. He would hire me every year to play in some band that he was putting together. And so not every year, but at least 7 times. So I played those, and I played during this year. So all I can think of is that maybe I was in the Doug Like tribute band, and some of you knew Doug Like. You all know Tim Like, and his dad was Doug, and Doug did the paper before Tim did, and also was in charge of the printing business, although really it was Audrey, his wife. Anyway, and Doug played jazz trombone also. But after he died, and I didn't look up to see when that was, but I guess there was a Doug Like tribute band, and maybe that was the band I played in that year. But I have an entry that I played the Ripon Jazz Fest and got X number of dollars. I will say this about, especially since Craig, no, I'd say it even if Craig was here. The Ripon Jazz Festival was not really about jazz. And the only group here that I had ever heard of when I went back to look at this was Derald Sturmer, who is right here. And he's in my Wisconsin Riffs book. But by then, he wasn't a jazz player either. Derald was a great, great player, and still is, who started out in these fusion bands in Milwaukee the same time I was playing with Matrix. And in fact, the drummer we ended up with was in Derald's band originally down there. But then Derald discovered he could make a lot of money playing with the prog rock group Genesis. And then Phil Collins split off by himself, and Derald played with Phil Collins for like 30 years. And it didn't matter where they were going. And Derald, he lived in LA for a while, lived in New York for a while, but then he just moved back to Wisconsin because Phil Collins would call him and fly him anywhere. So he decided to do that. And then Derald, back then in 2003, the early 2000s, he started putting bands together from time to time, and they would do gigs. And they were really good bands. They were sort of jazz bands. But really, I mean, I got to figure that Walter Wolfman Washington was a blues person. And I don't know Brian Lee at all, but it kind of has that blues look about him. And that's what this festival sort of turned into. And in its early days, there were some acts that were kind of pretty much sort of jazz acts. But those of us playing jazz, we were on at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, and as the day progressed and the night came on, the bands were increasingly not jazz, which is fine. I know Craig wanted to make some money and get a certain kind of crowd in. And so he did that, but that was the Ripon Jazz Festival. So there's a history project somebody can do, is go back and find all that. This was all Craig could find for me in a week's time, but I appreciate his sending that to me. Okay, so here's another thing that kind of gets lost here in Ripon, but I would submit to you that a lot of really good jazz has gone on in this community, right over there, and especially down the hill at the Rodman Center, where there's been a jazz band for a long time. Now, there was a precursor to the jazz band that was called the Falconaires. And I only know about this from two things. One is Al Jarreau, who I'm going to be talking about pretty soon. He and his vocal group, they went to the Notre Dame Jazz Festival in 1962. And they were a featured act, and they had a huge success there. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But another band that went to this competition, and Al's group, they were not in the competition. They were a featured group or something like that. But the college bands were in competition. You can't read it from where you are, I'm sure, but it was the Falconaires from Ripon College up there listed at the top. So they were there the same time that Al Jarreau was there with the Indigos. I don't know how long the Falconaires were around, but they were around long enough. And this must have been made close to the same time, because the names of the band are on the center label of the record that was in this jacket. And there was a lot of crossover between this band and that one that was at Notre Dame. But I guess they went on a USO tour. And I talked to Andy the other day, and I said, do you know anything about this? Because Andy Prelwitz is our college librarian, and he does the archives and all that kind of thing. He said, no, I have no idea about this. And by then it was too late for me to try to look it up. You know, I Googled Ripon College Falconaires, and the only thing that came up was that program you just saw before and this, but nothing about a tour or dates or anything like that. And it's out there somewhere, but not easily accessible. Anyway, so this was back in the 60s. But the jazz band, and Doug Northrup might know more about this, but he's probably just put it out of his mind. I think maybe it became part of the curriculum in about 1977, because that's the first program I found in the old Ripon College program books from the music department that has a Ripon College jazz band program in it. And it was first run by Ray Stahura, who taught for many, many years at the college. I started teaching at Ripon College in 1980, part-time. And the next year I was more part-time. And the year after that, I was full-time, although I was on a cheap little adjunct contract. Anyway, but Ray said, he doesn't need protection. Ray said to me, he says, as long as you're here, you know more about this than I do. Why don't you take over the jazz band? So I took over the jazz band in 1982. I look for pictures, and if anyone ever wants to do it, you can go to the Ripon College website through the library, and other college, practically every other college in the country, I think, to their websites, and you can find yearbooks online. Well, the yearbooks paid no attention to the jazz band. I found a few pictures eventually. This was from the 1999-2000 yearbook. And that was a pretty good group, actually. And you can see it's a nice, healthy bunch of students there. There was one high school student in, and one faculty member, who some of you know, David Scott, was playing trombone. But the rest were these young, eager musicians from all over who were playing in the jazz band then. And now I'm going to jump to 2019 in the spring. And this was my last jazz concert at Ripon College. And I picked this for a couple of reasons. One is a continuity thing. But on this concert, my son Paul, who was playing trumpet right there, he had been commissioned by a group of students, and probably some others threw some money in. They commissioned him to write a piece for me to play on that concert, which was really great. And my son Paul, he writes like crazy. His music is really, really good. And Ruth is shaking her head. Yes, she didn't have to, but she knows. And so, and I'm going to give a shout out to Kate Myshevsky, who was really the leader of that, who's teaching down in Shorewood now. Or is that right? Shorewood, yeah. Anyway, but they put this thing together, so they made it worth Paul's time to write a piece for me. But he had also written, a whole album of big band stuff that I was fortunate enough to be in on, that we recorded in Chicago the year before. And one of those tunes was so great, I said, Paul, we got to do this, and the band can play it. They won't play it great, but they'll play it. And so there's Paul soloing. Now, Paul did not follow me directly as jazz band leader at Ripon College, but it was the year after, so the person who replaced me, Toby Shuka, he did jazz band his first year there, but then the next year it was like, why don't we have Paul come in and do this, and I'll do the rally band. And so now my son Paul runs the jazz band at Ripon College, which is kind of a nice line after I had led it for a really long time, 37 years, I think. Anyway, when you read about or hear about the jazz bands giving a concert, go hear it, okay? That's that. All right, any questions up to now? Because I'm about to switch gears, and I'm just about on time, too. This is for those of you who thought you were going to get the Al Jarreau talk. So here's Al Jarreau. Stop, Al, not yet. We're not quite ready for you. I want you to hear that, but not till I've said a few words. This picture of Al Jarreau is from 2006 when he performed at Ripon College. And it was actually the first time, except for singing the national anthem at a football game or two, that he had performed at Ripon College since he graduated in 1962. Because at a certain point, he was too big to come back to Ripon College. It would cost way too much money. Now, David Joyce, who was president at that time, said, we don't care what it costs, we got to get Al here, which he did. And Al, of course, was happy to donate his time. And one of the things that I would say too, especially if I was at Ripon College right now, but you're close, is all over the world. He talked about Ripon College, and he'd say, "Anybody out there from Ripon College?" I mean, I saw a concert, a tape of a concert he did just months before he died in Monte Carlo, and he says to the audience, "Hey, you all know that little school in Wisconsin, don't you?" And he talks about Ripon College. I have a friend who used to see him all the time in Seattle. He said he always asks if there's anybody from, anyway. So, oops, we got to go back here. So he finally came back in 2006, and he donated his time, but his band didn't. I mean, these were big time guys from the West Coast mostly. And so they had to be paid, and you had to have this huge sound system and lights and all that. So Ripon College maybe didn't make a cent off it, but it was a great, great event. And whatever Ripon College lost, they made up for it in other ways. And so Al Jarreau, by then, was a huge international star. And now I will play that music if I can get in here where I want to be. I'm not sure I can, though. Let's see what happens. This is what he sounded like. This actually is from the 70s, but Take a little time out with me. Oh, just take five, just take five. Just stop your busy day and take the time out to see that I'm alive, I'm alive. Although I'm going out on my way just so I can pass by each day. Not a single word do we say. So pantomime and all the time still I know I'm out for me. I put things out to my feet. When you smile this much too discreet and suddenly come away. Wouldn't it be better not to be so polite? But you could offer a light. Just start a little conversation now, it's all right. But you take it by. This song goes on for quite a while, and it's great all the way through. You hear sort of what he did back then. He was not your typical jazz singer. He definitely was not your typical pop singer, although he became a well-known pop singer. He just sang like Al Jarreau. So, how many of you have been to one of my Al Jarreau talks before? Okay. Well, I'm just wondering if I should read some of what I often read at the Al Jarreau talks. You've forgotten about it by now, right? Okay. And I won't read the whole thing because if I read the whole thing, it's like 10 minutes. But I will read you some just to give you a little background about Al Jarreau. And yeah, there he is when he was still a baby in 1940. But I do want to read a little bit from the introduction of this book. My name is Al Jarreau. I'm from Milwaukee. I sing jazz and I sing pop and I sing R&B, and sometimes I mix the things and they come out sounding like Al Jarreau from Milwaukee. These are the first words spoken by Al Jarreau in the 2016 French documentary film, Al Jarreau L'Enchanteur. By the way, the maker of this film just got in touch with me like a month ago, and it was really great. I never heard from him, and he was very complimentary, and I was very complimentary back. It's a great film. Anyway, by this late point in his career, Al was truly a citizen of the world, possibly more famous in Europe than in the United States. Nonetheless, he identified with the place where he grew up, a Midwestern industrial city where his family had moved just a few years before Al was born in 1940. Al spent the first 18 years of his life in Milwaukee. He left to attend college in Little Ripon, Wisconsin, then returned to the city after graduation. By the time he left Milwaukee again in 1962 for graduate school at the University of Iowa, he had already started his professional career as a singer. Although he returned to Milwaukee to perform both during and after his 2 years in Iowa City, he was never again a resident of Wisconsin's largest city. He left for California in 1964 and lived there for the rest of his life. Yet it seems he never really thought of himself as a Californian. More than 50 years after moving away, Al described himself as Al Jarreau from Milwaukee. His hometown had influenced his values and provided him with a musical foundation. His school, his church, and especially his family shaped him into the man and artist we know today. So he came back to Milwaukee in 2016 for the last time to get a big award, a Lifetime Achievement Award from a music educators group. And it was a huge deal at the Pfister Hotel. And when he was back in town, he did what I found out he often did, which was to get in a car with people and say, drive me around. Okay, take a left there and do this. And so he would go around to his neighborhood and the places he had been, and he'd remark about this and he would remark about that. And the things he had to say were insightful, sentimental, touching, and just really some amazing stuff. And about when he was home for that time, they took a bunch of film of him when he was working with school kids in Milwaukee during that week, and when he was doing this, that, and the other thing. But they actually filmed him when he was on this car ride, but they didn't put any of that into it. But I was able to see that film as long as I didn't make any copies. I couldn't take it with me. I couldn't do any of that, but I was allowed to see that. And it just was phenomenal seeing and hearing what he had to say about where he grew up and his family and running cross country as a high school guy and all that kind of stuff. And if I were to read all this introduction, it's all about that trip that he took through town and what he saw and these observations he made. I think I will read the tail end of this, though. It's all so good. It's like I'm going to read some. Al also recalled the sounds of his old neighborhood. From over the fence in his backyard, he used to hear the clatter of pins falling at the CYO bowling alley, where he occasionally worked as a pin setter. All through the night, polkas and the sounds of people dancing would drift in through his bedroom window from Mike Blahosky's Polka Tavern next door. I know more polkas than Frankie Yankovic, he joked. When asked how he was able to sleep with the noise of bowling and polkas in the air, Al replied he slept like a baby. Families with 6 children were not disturbed by a little outside noise, he said. We were families who were not rich. I'm not sure what you would call it. Not even middle class. We were approaching middle class. People worked hard and felt good about themselves, and so, yeah, we slept pretty darn good. Al teared up upon seeing the building that once housed his grade school, Henry L. Palmer School on North First Street. My mother would bring me and I would sing a little song at PTA meetings, he remembered. And he talked about Lincoln High, where deaf and blind students, as well as those with other mental and physical disabilities, receive special instructions on the top floor of the school. They were sent here to go to school with blacks, Italians, kids from the other side of the tracks, he said. Doesn't get talked about very much, but this is an important part of the history of that building. Upon being asked how this affected him, Al responded, I'm a master degreed rehabilitation counselor, which he was. He went to the Ripon College and then he went to the University of Iowa and got a master's degree in rehabilitative counseling. It got in me, helping professions. I'm in a helping profession right now. My music is a small little ministry. It has to do with you are okay. We are okay. We're children of God. We're okay. Don't let anybody tell you that you're less than a child of God. Come on, let's sing together and have some fun and wake up in the morning and feel better. For a second time on the car trip, Al teared up. People, when they hear me say, I can, like any other man, reach out and touch the face of God, which is a famous line from one of his songs. Hey, man, that's part of this training that I got here in these classrooms and in my church that just has me realizing there are some things that we owe each other as children of God, trying to do as well as we can on this planet. I can stop there. There's another couple of summarizing paragraphs there, but that's enough. So here he is with his mother, Pearl, and here he is with his family. And there are only two people in that picture that look like maybe they could go on in showbiz. One is Al, of course, on the right. Look at that smile. You know, he was 7 years old at that time. And his sister, not the one directly next to him, but next to that, she could have done it too, but instead, Rosemarie, who is now Rosemarie Freeman, she went on and was the first person in the higher management of Mobil Oil Company who was, number one, a woman, and number two, African American. And I've got to talk about Rosemarie a little bit too. When I started this book, Al was already dead. His brother Marshall was alive. His brother Alpheus was alive. And Rosemarie was alive. His other brother and his other sister were dead. His parents were long dead. Rosemarie is the only one still alive, and she's 90. She was 6 years older than Al, and she was unbelievable in my doing this book. She sent me all these pictures. We talked on the phone all the time. I still talk with Rosemarie at least once a month. I talked with her just a week and a half ago, and oh man, she is a pistol, I'll tell you. And she will not keep her political opinions to herself, and it's fantastic. And not only that, but she lives in Canada. It's like, oh, geez. Anyway, so there's the family, and this was just before or just after they had done a family concert. They all sang. They sang in different groups, except Pearl didn't sing, the mother, but she played for everybody. She played piano or organ. She was the church organist also. Al's dad was originally a minister, but once all the kids were there, he had to moonlight to make enough money to support them, and the church got mad at him and kicked him out. So he said, okay, so he worked a factory job for the rest of his life. But there was but they were all very talented and singers. Al said a couple of his brothers were probably better singers than he was, but I doubt that, but they were pretty darn good. And his dad was a great singer. Okay, here we are. Talk about East Central Wisconsin. This picture was taken on the very street that's out here, Watson Street in Ripon, Wisconsin, because here's Al Jarreau, who was one of maybe one African American who was at Badger Boys State that summer. And a lot of you know what Badger Boys State was. It's sponsored by the American Legion. And every year, schools from all over the state would send their young leaders from the junior class in high school. And, you know, there's no way to know how many African Americans were here at Badger Boys State in 1957, but it probably was a handful at best. Al's dad didn't want him to come. He says, it's not safe up there, which was a legitimate concern, I would say. But Al came up, and he already had this incredible charisma. So what happens at Badger Boys is they do a mock government thing for the week, and they have their cities, and they have their councils, and they have this and that. And then at the end of the week, they elect a governor. Al Jarreau was elected governor. So it was like he overcame whatever things might have been going on, and they wanted him governor. So for that, he got to ride down the street in a convertible down Watson Street with a couple of the American Legion guys. And because he was at Badger Boys State, a year later, he came to Ripon College. And there's a lot more of the story than that, but that's what happened. Al was quite the athlete in high school also. He was an all-city baseball player in Milwaukee. He was a good basketball player, and he and his younger brother got second and third place in the state cross-country meet one year. And anyway, he was a talented guy. When he got to Ripon, he did baseball and basketball his freshman year, but he also almost flunked out. And he talks about that. And so he felt like he could only do one sport. And he thought he was going to get kicked out of school, but Doc Weisky, who was a basketball coach at that time, because he lost his scholarship, he had a boys' state scholarship, but his grades weren't good, so he lost that. But Doc Weisky like found an on-campus job for him or something, and so he was able to make that up and come back. And so he played basketball all 4 years. He was sixth man on the team, for those of you that know basketball. So he was the first guy off the bench, and apparently was really good in that role. And he kind of squeaked by as a student, but he felt like, he just didn't, even though he was a really good student in high school, it was a school that the academic standards were not what they were for most Ripon College students. So this was 1958 through 1962. What else he did, though, was he sang with this group. He and Peter Bach, who was sitting at the piano there, they decided, we should have a singing group here. And so they put together this group of 4 people, and Peter's at the piano, but they sang a cappella. And they did some stuff that was kind of doo-wop sort of things, but they actually sang jazz, and they did jazz arrangements, which was an unusual thing for a group like this to be doing at that time. And so they were at that Notre Dame Jazz Festival. I don't know who had heard them, but said, we want you down here to come sing. And Peter Bach sent me a recording of them at this festival, and the place went crazy when they were singing. And they normally sang without any accompaniment, but they lined up like the week before a rhythm section to play with them, which kind of helped what they were doing. And the judges that week, I can't remember who else it was, but Quincy Jones was one of them, and Henry Mancini was another one who was considered a jazzer back then. And anyway, so they went there, and they were offered a record contract there, but Al was the only one that said, yeah, I'll do it, because the others, there were reasons why they couldn't do it. So Al ended up going to the University of Iowa, getting his master's degree. Here's a picture of the family, some of the family, while he was a student at Iowa, but this was back in Milwaukee when he and his first wife, Phyllis, came back. And that's Rosemarie sitting in front of Al there. And she said, I don't think I met her more than one time, so this must have been it. And I'm not sure they were married yet, or if they got married the next year, because she put the date 63 on this, and he was there 63, 62, 3, 4. But anyway, and one of the other things that you see from this, which is an interesting dynamic of this family, is that this is only part of the whole mixed racial thing they had going in this family. I mean, this was the wife of Marshall. And that's Emil, and his wife was white, and Al's first wife and his second wife were both white, and there were just all these different connections, and he just said, this is just the way we were, what's the big deal? Well, for a lot of people it was a big deal, but not for the Jarreaus. So Al, after he finished at Iowa, there are all kinds of, I could talk all night about how all this worked, but he ended up in California. And he was working for the state of California in downtown San Francisco as a counselor. And he was working with people and families who needed help. He said he was a terrible counselor, but I have the feeling he was a really good counselor. But what he was bad at was, this is another thing, John, I was actually good at this, but it's what I hated about my job, is paperwork, okay? And he just said, I could not keep up with the paperwork. And so, but in the meantime, he was singing, in clubs. And eventually he was doing pretty well singing in clubs in San Francisco. And, if you think about this, this was mid 60s going on. This was Haight-Ashbury and, that whole drug scene and all those bands that came out of San Francisco at that time. Anyway, but he was in that, and he was singing jazz. He eventually ended up singing a duo with a guitar player, and they went to Southern California. They got on the Playboy Club circuit, which was a circuit back then where you would sing it, you would play at one club and another, and there were like 10 or 12 of them around the country. And he did that for a year or almost 2 years and made a pretty decent living. At that time, he showed up on Johnny Carson's show. Some of you remember Merv Griffin, David Frost. He ended up doing all that, but he still couldn't get a break. Eventually, he came back to California and kept doing this duo and was finally discovered. And it's a big story. I won't go into it now, but he was discovered by a record label that said, "We don't know what you're going to do with you," which is what everybody had said up to that time, "but we've got to have you on our label." And that was 1975. And then his first record came out still in 75. He was 35 years old by then. You can't do that now. I mean, if you're over 22 or 3, forget it. We don't want you. And when you're 22 and 3, we want you. And then we're going to get everything we can out of you. And in 3 or 4 years, we're going to ball you up and throw you away. I'm sorry. The business is a business. But with Al, he was 35. His third record was this one, which was recorded live in Europe. He was a star in Europe before he was in the United States. And they finally figured out, to really get a good idea of what Al Jarreau is about, we need to record him live. And that little clip I played before was from this album. And so he toured Europe, and they recorded a bunch of concerts and then put it out as a double album. And this was won the first of his 6 Grammy Awards. And Al Jarreau was the first person, I don't think anyone's done it since, to win a Grammy in jazz, in pop, and in R&B over the course of his first 10 or 12 years of his career once it finally developed. I'm getting there. This one was his 5th album. And if any of you are into this, and now I'm going to blank on the guy's name, but this was taken by the famous portrait and celebrity photographer. I'll think of it. Anyway, so that's where he had gotten by his 5th album was, here you are, and you're being photographed by this. And this album did really well. The one after that did even better than that. So he really had a peak in the mid 80s, but he wasn't willing to just stay with that. And it's real interesting following his whole career, because probably you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and keep a career going in the business. But he didn't want to. And so after this album and the next one and the next one, which were all similar, but were all just fantastic pop-ish albums, he went off in a slightly different direction. And then he started doing R&B. Then he started doing that, and he started doing that. And they all thought he was chasing the money, but he wasn't. He was chasing, I want to try this kind of music. I want to try that kind of music. It's not the best thing for a career, but he could keep alive because he had established a name. And he could work in Europe for the rest of his life and never come to the United States and be quite comfortable, which he didn't choose to do. But Richard Avedon was the photographer here. Anyway, so here's a picture of him and his sister Rosemarie in 1999. And here we are back at Ripon College in 2006 with his saxophonist and the guy who was his music director at that time, Joe Turano, who was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Joe was a huge help to me with the book. And it was so great for me to be able to talk to all the musicians who, not all of them, but important musicians who worked with Al. So there he is at Ripon. And after he did this concert, he held court across the hall from where the concert had been, and across the parking lot, actually. And he was happy to pose for pictures with just about anybody, like me and my wife, Maria. And he did this for an hour at least. He was standing there and knew just what to say. And he just had this magic about him personally. And the big thing about Al Jarreau was everybody said at every concert, I know he was just, I mean, in their head, he was singing to me. You know, he wasn't singing to them. He was singing to me. He had that skill that is so rare. And then I was talking about that event that happened in Milwaukee not long before his death. Oh, not yet. One more to go. This was when Al came back for his 50th reunion at Ripon College. And this was before the Wisconsin Riffs book came out, and I wanted to talk with him. And it was not widely known that he was going to come back. You know, it wasn't announced. Al Jarreau's coming back. But people in a couple of the offices on campus knew he was, and they set me up so that I could talk with Al. So here we are, and we're sitting out in front of the Evans, what's the Evans Center. Now, it was in the summer. And they said, here you are, you can talk with Al. Well, talking with Al, so I would talk with him for 30 seconds, and then somebody would come up to, Al, remember me? And remember that time we did this? And so, you know, he would talk with them and be just as great as he could be. And then he'd talk with me for another 30 seconds. And then we'd go on, you know, and then people came. So it was a great experience for me, but I hardly got anything out of that interview. I did get that Frankie Yankovic quote, though, from that interview. And he sang one of the polkas for me also. Anyway, so that was 2012. And then that event in Milwaukee, here we are, and somebody in the advancement office realized maybe somebody put a bug in their ear, that it would be good to have a student or two go to this. And so they said, yeah, that would be a good idea. And, you know, maybe they should be music students, and maybe one of their music professors should go too. So I ended up being able to go to that with a couple of my students who you see there. And there's Al, and he did this on a number of occasions, I understand, with various people. So there's Kate Myshevsky again and Mitchell Ethan. And they got there and said, you're Ripon College students? Okay, sing the alma mater for me. You know, like, oh, geez. Anyway, and it was at that time, although I had no intention at that time of writing a biography of Al Jarreau, but there was his sister, Rosemarie, who I met that night, who maybe kind of remembered it when I connected with her again a few years later. I think she did sort of remember too. Oh, yeah, you were with that. Anyway, but there we were, and we're at the Pfister Hotel, and it was a big deal. It was really fun. That's what I got. I could have way more, but that's plenty. I'll stop now. It was just barely over an hour. Are there questions?
So I was curious, I didn't realize John Harmon wrote for Matrix.
Oh, yeah.
He was your professor.
Yeah.
So had he written music before you all went on the road, or was he just that prolific?
Well, he was like Paul. He was writing all these arrangements for the jazz band at Lawrence. And he had written a bunch of, you know, trio pieces for him and his cohorts also. But at Lawrence, he started writing big band pieces. And then the Matrix thing, yeah, we started out doing covers. You know, we were doing Stevie Wonder and the Beatles and this, that, and the other thing. But we were doing some jazz tunes, but we started doing some originals early on. And Fred Sturm was writing a lot of them too. And then eventually when we decided, we're not going to make much money anyway, let's just do all originals, that eventually we switched to doing all originals, at which time we didn't work for about 2 months. But then people started saying, you know, that band was pretty darn good, and what are they doing now? And we had some fortunate experiences that kept us going. And so anyway, but yeah, he wrote a whole lot of that music. Yeah. Doug.
Did all of the Matrix members have a connection to Lawrence?
No.
You picked them up?
It started out that all of us had a connection to Lawrence except for our bass player. And we didn't have a bass player at Lawrence who could or would do what we wanted to do. And so we picked up this rock and roll bass player from the Valley. And he was a really good singer too, which we didn't even know at first. But in our early days, that was a great thing. We had another guy in the band who was a really good singer. One of the guys, our drummer at that time, was someone, I don't know if anybody would know here, but it was Tony Wagner, who taught at the high school. He taught PE at the high school here in Ripon for a while. And he left us early on, Tony did. And he was not a Lawrence student, but he had been playing with the jazz band at Lawrence. He was a local Appleton guy. And all the rest of us were either students, former students, or John Harmon when Matrix started. But along the way, there were some personnel changes. So by the end, there were 5 of us who were originals and 4 who weren't. But that was that deal. Travis.
Well, so I have a non-music related question, kind of, which is that you clearly have done a huge number of interviews, like hundreds probably at this point. Do you have any tips on how to be effective at that? Do you tape record? Do you take notes? Do you prepare in any way?
I do record them.
Yeah.
I do prepare, of course, and I write, this is what I really want to know. But I found partway through doing riffs, when I was talking to all these people, some of whom I knew a lot about, some I knew barely anything about, the trick was to get them talking and me not talking at all. You know, just say, okay, tell me about your career. And some of them would be like, oh, you know, but others was like, that was all they needed. And they would take off. But if you can find what it is that makes them happen, and there was a very famous guy who taught at UW-Madison for years, who was one of the greatest bass players, string bass players in jazz history, Richard Davis, who was down at Madison. And it was really hard to get so I could talk with him at all. And then when I did, this was on the phone, which I don't like that much anyway, but you know, when I was doing the Al book, everything was on the phone because I did almost all of it during COVID. But with Richard, I thought after about 3 minutes, 5 minutes at the most, I thought, this is it. I might as well just say, forget it. But then I found the one thing that he wanted to talk about, which was not music related. But he was doing a lot of work at Madison at that time in Black studies. And so I asked him about this, and then he took off. And then I was able to kind of steer him towards the music and talk about this and that. And it was still a fairly short interview, but I thought it was going to be a disaster, and it was really pretty good because partly his professional life was a matter of public record. But you want to get stuff that's not part of public record. And so, but yeah, you want to be prepared, because if they start talking about something you don't know about, that's not good. But it happens, because there's a lot, you can't know everything. But yeah, I try to prepare really hard, and then I try to get them to talk and me not to talk. But sometimes that's easy and sometimes it's not. So.
That picture you have there, when you mentioned the name Mitchell Eaton,
Mm-hmm.
he was very involved in the community when he was a student here. He would contact me 2 or 3 years in a row, and he'd bring a group down to Webster's and play while they were ringing bells for the Sunday
Saxophone groups, yeah. Yeah, Mitchell was quite a guy. He was a math major, but he was very involved with music all the way through. I'm pretty sure he ended up getting a music minor. And Mitchell's a minister now. Yeah, he ended up getting his divinity degree from Duke. But then I'd heard maybe he was thinking about leaving that. But anyway. So. And his mother writes handbell music for choirs, interestingly. So. Any other questions? I'm not expecting any of this to happen, but again, if any of you want to leave here with a book, I can help you out with that. But, you know, anytime if there's anything you want to know that you think I might know, you can get in touch with me still through Ripon College. You know, I got email there and so forth. So, but thanks a lot for coming.